Oh, hello. Chris Myers here again with another episode of the Cinema Shame podcast. Mind if I smoke? Smooth. Anyway, you caught me at an interesting time. Some guy with a trench coat asked me to take this test, and it has the weirdest questions. Like, here's an example. Your child shows you their butterfly collection, plus the killing jar. What do you say? I would take him to the doctor. Okay, next. You're watching television. Suddenly, you spot a wasp crawling on your arm. How do you react? I kill it. You're listening to the Cinema Shame podcast on the podcasting service of your choice. The episode is about one or more of the cuts of Blade Runner with special guest Mike Sterling. You really enjoy it. What do you do? I subscribe and leave a good Hey! I think I know who that guy in the trench coat was. Anyway, on with the show.
We've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Movies based on TV shows produced and distributed by Orion. We've watched careers go dark faster than you can say Heaven's Gate. All these moments trapped on film, like tears in rain. Time to start another episode. Hi, and welcome to yet another very special episode of Cinema Shame, where James Patrick and Alan Mott get people to talk about movies they've avoided their entire lives.
We've not avoided them, let's be clear.
Yeah, they have avoided them. Yeah,
the guest has avoided them. We always know the movies. We are
not intentionally, I should add that.
We are all Joe Dante.
Today we are thrilled to be joined by everyone's favorite comic book store owner, Sterling Silver Comics' Mike Sterling, who for the past 20 years has been entertaining nerds with his blog, Progressive Ruin. Like anyone who's been online since before some of their coworkers were even born, Mike's social media presence is at least partially defined by a handful of callbacks and bits that he's returned to with charming frequency. Since I first became aware of Mike, I've lost count of the times I've seen him mention that he's just watched a terrible movie that was universally panned and that he didn't mind it. And oh yeah, he still hadn't sat down to watch Blade Runner. But maybe he might get to it someday. Well, for all of you Mikester maniacs out there, that day has come. The bit is now retired. Mike Sterling has finally seen what is arguably the most influential science fiction movie of all time. Now, whether or not he liked it is what we're going to be talking about for the next 90 minutes or so. Hi, Mike.
Hello. Thank you for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. And I suppose I should have watched Blade Runner before this started. No, I did finally watch it after I did have a false start trying to watch it some time ago. I actually got the disc from Netflix and just never got around to it. I really intended to watch it and I just didn't. So the bit continued even after that, I guess.
Well, the question we always open the show with is why had it taken you so long to watch it? Like, was there a specific reason why you didn't see it at the time and never caught up with it? Or, like, was it just like you tried that once and then just never tried it again?
There wasn't really a reason. I mean, 82 was a big year for genre film, like yeah. Swamp Thing and I'm sure some others. But I just never got around to seeing it. I never caught it on VHS or on video. Like I said, I tried to get it from Netflix, and I just ended up not watching it when I got it. I just never seemed to make the time. And not out of lack of interest. It's just one of those things that never happened.
Watching it, were the things that you sort of like picked up on and knew about just because of sort of the cultural osmosis, or was it really just a completely like new experience for you watching it?
No, you kind of stole the words right out of my mouth there. Cultural osmosis is what it is. Just because of who I am and my particular interest, I would watch, I would be interested in science fiction and, what's Harrison Ford doing, that sort of thing. So I'm aware of it. I'm aware of the discussion around it. Some odd things, like I didn't know Roy Batty, that name came from this movie. And I've seen that name floated around a few times. I never knew the context for it. And I know, not getting into too many spoilers, right?
Oh no, we spoiler right from the beginning, right from the thing. Okay. We are a spoiler-friendly podcast.
Okay. That whether or not Deckard is a replicant or not, I knew that was a question.
Yeah.
So I went into the movie with that in mind. It's like, okay, what are the clues that he's a replicant? Is this something that's actually informed by the text, or is it something that crazy fans came up with on their own?
It's the crazy fan part.
Well, what my anecdote is that when I was in college, the director's cut had just come out, and I was talking to a friend who was a big. He actually is Wayne Santos. He actually has published a sci-fi book, so he was that big a fan, and he got really annoyed with me because I was like, "Oh, Deckard is obviously a replicant." And at that point, I hadn't seen the director's cut yet, which is where basically like. That sort of like if there's going to be directorial sort of like evidence of it, it's in the director's cut. It's not in the first theatrical edition. But I was basing it just purely on the fact that he collected photos the same way Leon collected photos, and that just made sense to me. It's like, well, clearly there's a thing there. It wasn't until the later films I was like, oh yeah, no, he's 100% a replicant.
Is he a replicant or a replicant?
Replicant.
Wake up. Time to die.
So we watched, so everyone knows, we watched the final version, which is, I don't know, Mike told me he didn't do any sort of research about any of this stuff and left it all to us. So basically,
I watched the film, and then aside from getting a cast list to make sure I got all the names and actors right, I've avoided any information or discussion about it beyond what I've already kind of heard over the decades about this film.
Basically, the main difference between the movie you watched and the movie that was released in theaters is that the theatrical cut has this infamously terrible narration that they threw in there because they were worried that people wouldn't know what was going on. And it's especially terrible because Harrison Ford, who really had a miserable time making the movie, but also really hated the narration, basically delivers it like basically as much of a fuck you as possible.
They don't advertise for killers in a newspaper. That was my profession. Ex-cop. Ex-Blade Runner. Ex-killer.
So it's very flat and very sort of not good, but he's deliberately tanking it. And then they actually took a sequence from The Shining of the car driving through the mountains, and they added a happy ending to that, where he basically says oh, somebody told me that Rachel doesn't have an end date, so we're going to live happily forever, as they're driving through the mountains, escaping the city. And that's how the original theatrical cut ended. So that is there is a genuinely massive difference between the final version and the version that was originally released in theaters. But the reason why I wanted to talk to you, Mike, is because I've always been sort of fascinated by whether or not the final version makes sense if you haven't seen the original version with the narration for the dummies. If the fact that we've seen it with the version where everything is explained to us, does that make it easier for us to watch this new version and go oh, I know exactly what's going on?
No, I'm not going into it 100%, fresh because, like I said, I've heard stuff about it in the past.
Yeah.
But having seen it, the film does make narrative sense. There is ambiguity to it, of course, but that's a very sort of 70s element of the film, I guess, sort of the dystopian nature of it, the not necessarily happy ending.
Gaff had been there and let her live. 4 years, he figured. He was wrong. Tyrell had told me Rachel was special. No termination date.
Overall, yes, I think the plot itself isn't very complex. You get right down to it.
Yeah.
It's human form robots loose on Earth. Harrison Ford has to go find them, or Deckard has to go find them and take them out. And for the most part, he does. And that's essentially the plot. Everything else that makes this movie is all tone and setting and world building. And all of that makes sense in context, I believe. So, no, not having this narration, which, by the way, I have to hear now. I got to hear the not having the narration didn't affect my enjoyment of the film. I understood what was going on to the extent that it was, defined by the storytelling as opposed to the stuff that is deliberately left ambiguous.
Fiery the angels fell. Deep thunder rolled around their shores, burning with the fires of Orc.
I've always been under the belief that the narration was added because it didn't trust the simplicity of the story. The criticism on Blade Runner is that there is a barrier to entry because there's, I guess, we're not pointing at everything and calling it what it is. Like, oh, they're talking about souls here. Like, I've never understood the original criticism that it was difficult to understand without the narration. And maybe it's because it didn't hold anyone's hand, that the ending wasn't pat and resolved. And I always attributed that to being more like a true film noir, because that's what Blade Runner is in its bones, is a film noir construction. There are a bunch of shady or not great people with ulterior motives existing in an ugly world, post World War II, except now we're in post fleeing of the Earth. And the narration was there to really sort of hold your hand as you entered this world. And at the time, maybe people would have sort of balked at entering. But even that I disagree with, because we had just come out of the 70s, which was awash with futuristic visions and science fiction worlds. And I've never really, wrapped my head around the fact that they were worried people wouldn't get it.
I have heard people say that they have only watched the director's cut or the final version, and they were confused. So it is something I have heard.
Okay, let's play What Are They Confused By? Because
I have no idea, but
okay.
they have basically said that that for whatever reason, the way the film was made, they just couldn't. It didn't like it, because I think it's one of those ones where it's like when he does the detective work, it's not, there's no sort of like exposition going like, oh, I'm going to use my special like photography magnifier and blah blah blah. Yeah. And so there are these things that are just like, it's world building, it's presented as is without explanation. And some people, like, if it's something new to them, they really do need that explanation. I've never found the sort of narrationless versions confusing, but I've always wondered, is that
I'm going to go on the record right here, this is bold, right? Yeah. And I'm going to say that if you're one of these people that thinks this is a difficult movie to understand, you're a dum-dum. Okay, just laying it. I'm laying it out early here. With what, we're 12 minutes in. I'm laying it out right now. 19, whatever it is.
Those are some harsh words.
Because, as I said, it's a bare bones concept. You're dealing with what is essentially a detective looking for people, aka replicants, that he needs to eliminate. I mean, it's no more difficult than that. Everything else could be attributed to world building and window dressing, light and shadow, director's vision. It's adornment. And we're talking about this movie today because it's absolutely magnificent in that regard. If it were a contemporary detective story, this wouldn't be on a podcast. We wouldn't be talking about it at all.
Well, we have like the evidence of that because there are countless direct-to-video, low-budget sci-fi movies that were basically based on ripping off Blade Runner. And all they did was prove that no, you have to be Ridley Scott, and you have to, you cannot rip off this movie. You cannot replicate its style, and just like trying to ape its plot isn't going to work. It basically is a thing that, and even then, like you could argue that it took like Ridley Scott like 4 or 5 tries to get it to nail it, because there are so many different cuts out there. Well,
to be fair, we should talk about the cuts just briefly, because we were talking before recording about what we consider the official cuts, because Wikipedia and other sources have told me there are 7 cuts, but we have narrowed this down to 4 cuts that were actually worth mentioning, which would be the U.S. theatrical, which is what we talked about with the voiceover narration, the international cut, which was the same length essentially, but added slight more violence to, we think it's one scene. I've never seen the international cut. I can't vouch for that. And then came the director's cut in 1992, which curiously Ridley Scott didn't have anything to do with, besides some consultation about what he originally intended. You would think that they may have brought him in to do it, but no, they didn't do that. He didn't get his crack at it until 2007, when he released the actual final cut, which was his definitive version of the film.
Now, this is one of the reasons maybe I haven't seen the film, because I wasn't sure which cut is the one I'm supposed to be seeing, which is the true cut. And I understand now it's apparently the final cut, but I didn't know that before.
The final cut and the director's cut are in the same ballpark.
They're pretty much the same. Like, basically, like, the one major difference was they gave him the money to fix some like obvious mistakes. And, like, the most notable one is the scene where Zora is crashing through the windows as she's being shot. In the cuts previous to the final cut, it's very obviously a stunt double and not Joanna Cassidy going through the glass. Whereas by 2007, they had basically the technology to basically re-edit it, but also put in like Cassidy's face over the stunt double. I actually believe they actually brought Cassidy in and reshot it. Like, so that's why it was at that level of sort of attention to detail to that one. But yeah, like it is a case where, sometimes people complain about, directors being allowed to go back to their movies, but I'm always like, like a movie is only done because that's the release date was set.
Also, this was removed from him before it was released theatrically. He didn't have a say in the final edit. So what happened with the director's cut was essentially the vision that he had intended, and that removed the dumb ending and the voiceover and brought back the unicorn ending, and that's the Blade Runner that works as it's supposed to.
Yes, ma'am. There's been some reports that the management have been taking liberties with the artists in this place.
I don't know nothing about it.
Have you felt yourself to be exploited in any
So,
way?
Mike, what did you think? Like, it sounds like you liked the movie based on what.
Oh no, I enjoyed the film very much.
So basically, like, going into, like, did it feel like the Blade Runner you were expecting?
I think so, because like I said, I was aware it was built on the noir detective framework. So going in, that's what I was expecting, and that's pretty much what I got. Was Harrison Ford being a grizzled old detective, well, not so old, he's kind of baby-faced in this movie, but a detective doing his detective things, and here's the femme fatale sort of, and here's the bad guys roughing him up in the alley, and yeah, it was pretty much what I expected, but it overall it looked beautiful. The cinematography is still top notch in this film, and the design of everything is still great. And even the Vangelis music, I really liked how that worked with this film. So, it's overall, it gave me the experience I was kind of hoping for.
I was actually genuinely paranoid that, like, after all this build-up and you watching it, you'd be like, huh, is this what people are talking about?
Yeah, this is the big deal? Yeah, that's all right, I guess.
I don't think we've had. I was tracking back to all the movies we've done this with, the big movies, and I'm not sure we've really had an episode where, like, that movie sucked. What are we even doing?
I think the Ken Reed episode that is going to be like the First Blood was one where he generally.
I don't really consider First Blood to be the Citizen Kane of.
Yeah. Watching it, where you sort of like go, because as someone who's read a lot of comics, especially like throughout the 90s and that, were you like going like, huh, like that, I can see where they got that and where they got that. And
specifically, the note I actually made on that was that video games sure cribbed a lot from this film.
Yeah.
Especially that scene where Sebastian is walking through his building. I was looking at going, this is basically Arkham Asylum is what I'm looking at here. This is this is the scenery for, you know, those really grungy Batman games. I know it's been more people have sourced this for their own, you know, products, but it really struck me as a very video gamey movie.
Well, I would argue that probably a lot of people who are influenced by this movie, like this is, if you were to ask them what noir is, they would probably say Blade Runner before they would mention any of the movies that influenced Blade Runner. I feel like it's one of those movies that has come to sort of, you know, I think that's why it's so successful is that in terms of like people enjoying it as opposed to financially successful, which it wasn't. is that seeing that it is both like a really impressive sci-fi movie while also being one of the best noirs ever made. It just manages to like fuse the genres in a way that a lot of people attempt, but very few succeed.
I'm not in the business. I am the business.
Yeah, it's also 42 years old now, so
yeah.
it's had a lot of time to seep its way into culture.
Mm-hmm.
And for lots of people who weren't even born until maybe 20 years after this film came out, to them it's an old movie. It's like a black and white movie to me from the 40s.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just part of the culture, part of what falls within their particular line of interests. If they're into that sort of thing, into noir or sci-fi, it's just a classic. It's always been there for them.
It is interesting though, because it is a movie that is like 40 years old. But if you took away sort of like the 2019 date that and say like, oh, this is like 2069, I feel like this movie could be released today and feel like a fresh science fiction movie. I mean, we have evidence of that by the actual sequel, which, you know, really doesn't feel like any different.
I'm always, every time I rewatch this movie, I am always impressed anew by how good it actually looks now, even relative to its 1982 companions, relative to current movies, the way that Scott shoots this, the practical effects that he used, the way he used depth and mattes and light and shadows, and there are just moments that I am in awe of certain scenes in this film, and nothing looks that good today. Like, people are raving about Dune. Like, Dune is like the standard bearer for sci-fi, and it's not the same to me. Like, the way this movie looks is unto itself.
No, Blade Runner looks very ageless. I mean, everything in it looks, like you said, looks modern, like it could have come out a year ago instead of 42 years ago. And I think that reliance on practical effects and models and that sort of thing helps, because it all looks real, it all looks tangible. It doesn't look like a cartoon drawn by a computer. It looks like something you can reach out and touch. It's all very visceral.
I just do eyes. It's just eyes. Genetic design. Just eyes.
I also like that it is so detailed that, like, I've literally seen new things in it on my, like, 12th, 13th viewing. I actually got annoyed because I was watching a reaction video of someone watching it for the first time, and they noticed that, you know, there's the light in the replicant's eyes. And I was annoyed that they got that on their first viewing, because I don't think I noticed that until like literally the 10th time I saw it. Although it's sort of like they're watching it in high depth and I was watching it on a VHS tape, but I still, like, you know, stuff like that, where there are people who have watched these movies 100 times and they're still picking up on like little stuff here and there that they haven't noticed. And I think that's a mark to how much attention and detail was put into the production of this film.
One thing I was kind of curious about as I was watching the film regarding the whole flying cars thing.
Yeah.
Are the police the only people who have flying cars? Because I think those are the only ones you see during the course of the film, aren't they?
I don't know.
I always thought it was because this is what's left on Earth. Like this isn't wealth that's left behind. Anyone who has the means has already gone. So what we're left with here are, slums and the police and people who are capitalizing on the slums. So I think there's only a select few left that had the means to have flying cars, or the $30 million budget didn't allow for everyone to have flying cars.
There is a shot where you see off in the distance what looks like a stream of flying cars flying by. And you don't see it close enough to see any actual cars, but it's just like one little stream of them off in the distance. And the whole flying car thing, that's a cliche everybody talks about, when you are flying cars, that stuff. But I kind of like the idea that the flying cars are restricted to only a certain number of people, so it's not like the nightmare vision of Coruscant in the Star Wars prequels, where a million flying cars.
Yeah, let's rank the flying cars. We have Back to the Future 2 and Attack of the Clones.
Well, and also, like, in the movie, it almost seems like a parking issue, because you have the one scene where he's parked by the Bradbury, and, like, the cop goes by, hey, you're not supposed to park here. Right. And it's sort of like, maybe it's just because there are so many people on the actual ground that we don't see any of the cars on the ground, because there's literally no place to park. Mm-hmm. Everybody parks in the high-rises where we're not seeing them.
Right.
This sector's closed to ground traffic. What are you doing here?
I'm working. What are you doing?
Arresting you. That's what I'm doing.
I'm Deckard, Blade Runner 26354. I'm filed and monitored.
Hold on. Checking.
So I will, like, I think this is a great film, but there's always been one thing that bugged me in terms of its screenplay. And it's just one quick moment, but it's always the one I always go, huh, every time I watch it. And that's the scene with Emmett Walsh basically telling Deckard that he has to do this. But he has the thing where he tells them about, they only have, like a 4-year lifespan. And I'm like, if Deckard is the best Blade Runner out there, I'm pretty sure he knows all of this stuff about Blade Runners. So Emmett Walsh isn't telling Deckard this.
Listen, you can have Emmett Walsh telling it, or you can have it in the voiceover narration at the beginning. I think I know what we actually want here.
I still feel like they could have gotten that information across without sort of the captain telling someone, they are something they already know for our benefit.
They were designed to copy human beings in every way except their emotions. And the designers reckoned that after a few years, they might develop their own emotional responses. Hate, love, fear, anger, envy. So they built in a fail-safe device.
Which is what?
4-year lifespan.
So while we're on the screenplay, I think it's kind of an interesting how that got to its final form is kind of an interesting story, and I wish I knew more about it. The screenwriter, credited screenwriters are Hampton, who I didn't know, but he wrote The Mighty Quinn, which is a movie I really enjoy that doesn't get too much press.
Yeah,
but that makes sense because there's a lot in that movie that's also kind of this movie, except in the Caribbean. And then David Peoples, who had a much broader career and wrote stuff like 12 Monkeys and Lady Hawk and Unforgiven, oddly enough, which is what I didn't know when I was going into it. But it sort of had a twisty path until it got to Ridley Scott too, because the original adaptation was done by Herb Jaffe's son. Herb Jaffe was a producer who optioned it in the 70s, but Philip K. Dick hated it so much and that he told Jaffe how much he hated it, and Jaffe flew and threatened to kick his ass based on what he said about his son's script. I wish I had more, like, the meat of that story other than just a small Philip K. Dick anecdote about the meeting. So that obviously didn't work, and then it came back to the Functor. What's his name? I can't.
Hampton Fancher.
Hampton Fancher, yeah. Hampton Fancher optioned it in 1977, and that's when producer Michael Dealey convinced Ridley Scott to direct, but only after he declined and then took the job because he wanted off of Dune so badly. So they said it was to take his mind off his older brother's death, but I mean, the Dune production is so notoriously troubled. I have a hard time believing he wouldn't have already wanted off. I don't think he needed much of an excuse.
I've read Paul Salmon's making of book. It's been a while, but if I remember correctly, like basically the actual sort of plot we can credit to Fancher, but the actual Blade Runner-ness is David Webb Peoples.
Yeah, well, that makes perfect sense based on what they've done.
Yeah.
One thing I did want to note, having just seen Alien Romulus, which, if you haven't seen it, it's basically every previous Alien movie mushed together into one thing. But it does lean pretty heavily on the aesthetic from the first film with the clunky retro technology. The stuff that makes the weird beeping noises and everything, the monitors, the computational devices, they all feel very vintage in a way. It's a sort of, it's supposed to be in the future, but it still feels like it's in the past. And you get a little bit of that in this film as well, especially with that little photo analyzer device that Deckard uses at one point. And I did like to contrast that. We have this sort of clunky technology combined with these robots that are so super advanced that you can only tell them apart from humans with psychological tests. That goes back to Alien, where you had, this is a spoiler for Alien, I guess, where you had Ash hanging around and none of the crew members knew he was a robot. So you had the clunky tech with the advanced, android technology in that film as well. So I thought that was an interesting theme that sort of carried over into this new movie, into this other movie.
Sort of, I think that's the soul of Alien and Blade Runner, is that these aren't like the usual like sci-fi. This isn't like Logan's Run, where it looks like it's in a shopping mall. Yeah.
Well, those are the movies that have a longer shelf life. I mean, Alien and Blade Runner are testament to Scott's version of the future from the past, that we can watch them and marvel at how good they look on, Alien especially was a pretty limited budget, and what he was able to pull off with the simultaneous sense of being of the future, but also real and born of the things of the past. Like there's this grounded nature to everything where, you look at a lot of the sci-fi movies that popped up in the 70s that had lots of flashy lights and computer screens, and they just look so hokey now. And I think there's a barrier to getting a proximity to them because they're comically inept at predicting what a future would look like, as opposed to these visions that are, little cyberpunk, born of the past, and feel more like an alternate reality rather than a projection of where we're actually going.
It's something I sometimes think about when like I'm out about and I'm like on my phone, and it's like I'm walking around with this mini computer that would be, or like I have my like Apple Watch that I can use to call people, and it's like I literally have like a Dick Tracy, like radio watch on my thing, but it's just like it's so part of just how we exist that we don't really see it from that sort of way we do when we're watching a movie and somebody's using a new piece of tech and we're like, oh, wow, what is that? And I think that's why Ridley Scott is, because we don't have that, wow, what is that moment. It's just like, okay, yeah, this is just the tools that people use in this society. And it's the same, like, it's like if we filmed this now, like everyone has a smartphone and it's how you get around and it's what you do. It's not but it's like if you actually had that in like a movie like this, it would be like the most advanced thing in a movie like this.
Yeah, it's all practical, not flashy. There is one thing, you brought up one thing that kind of bothered you about this film.
Yeah.
I want to mention one thing that I think we could probably all relate to. I see we're all wearing glasses.
Yeah.
So when they do the psychological tests on the replicants, they set up that little, eye lens across the table from them that focuses on their eye, but there's like a whole table length between the two.
Yeah.
Now, when we go for eye tests, we've got our eye pressed up right into that machine. And we're told, don't blink, don't move your eye, while this machine directly against your face is doing a scan or taking a picture or whatever. And sometimes it has to be done again because you moved your eye or you shifted to your chair or something. There is no way these little lenses sitting across the table from the subject is going to be able to pick up. Is going to be able to stay focused on the eye. I just thought that was kind of amusing to me.
Well, that's not cinematic. That's where.
I know. I'm thinking real world here. It's like, no, this is what it is for the movie. I understand that, but I just thought it was funny. As someone who's been through more than my fair share of eyeball stuff in the last few years, I just thought that was kind of funny that here's this little lens that's supposed to focus on the person's eye and take readings the entire time. It's like, you've never been around people if you think that's going to work.
I just like the idea. I'm thinking now of like Sean Young in Joan Crawford mode, like drawing a cigarette while she's like at one of those optometrist things with her eyes. And it like that kind of robs the magic of that scene.
It'd be a little puff, just a little puff.
Do you mind if I smoke?
It won't affect the test.
Famously, Harrison Ford hated working on this movie. So did you feel like you could feel that in the movie? Because actually, this is one of probably my favorite Harrison Ford performance. To me, this gets at the heart of what made him such an appealing actor.
If he didn't like it, I think he may have. I mean, if he was expressing it at all, he was channeling it into his performance as sort of I've seen it all, done it all, kind of rough and tumble detective. I didn't get the sense that he was feeling like he was above the material or that he resented making this film. He played the part as it should have been played.
He's always had a different version of reality too, and his not liking something is kind of par for the course. I mean, what does he ever really love doing? I'm not sure.
People talk about grumpy Harrison Ford, but just having watched, I feel like that's a bit that he puts on. That he, like, it's part of like, it's sort of the same way like Charles Grodin, I think, used
have
to.
Have you read Carrie Fisher's memoir about Star Wars, the Princess Diaries?
Yeah.
I think that's just in his core, man. I don't know.
Well, I can't wait to hear what he has to say about this Marvel movie he's working on. Because when I saw the trailer and heard him say the words Captain America, I was just wondering, he must have been thinking about the check he was getting when he was saying that, because I can't picture him ever actually willingly saying the words Captain America to another adult.
I was oblivious about this movie until they showed the trailer before Alien Romulus, and I was like, what did he stumble onto the wrong set? How did this happen? Was it entrapment? What happened with this movie?
William Hurt died is what happened.
That doesn't explain why Harrison Ford then went...
They pushed a check across the table to him. He said, add a couple more zeros, and that's how they got him in there.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, money will buy Harrison Ford.
I mean, someone has to buy Calista Flockhart stuff.
Allegedly.
But anyway, back to the point of, I agree that this is one of, if not my favorite top couple Harrison Ford performances, because he doesn't have like a swagger or like a matinee irony to hide behind.
You said world weary, Mike, and I think the thing I like is, to me, there's almost like an innocence to Deckard. Like he's almost like more like the noir nebbish rather than the noir villain. Like he's basically, the guy who, gets overwhelmed by the situation, even though based on what we're told, he's the best. And
I think both can be true, but I do think both can be true, because if we're looking at this as the model of the post-World War II film noir, where this disillusionment that's set in on all these characters, and even then they're still not prepared for the horrors they're going to face on the other side of the war, and I think that's pretty true to this performance as well, in that he is run down, he is weary, he is, for all intents and purposes, rather broken by the job that he is trained to do, that he is good at doing. But when he's faced with this scenario, he is ill-equipped to respond as someone who's been there before. This is something that's entirely new to him.
I always think of the scene of him where he's playing like the cabaret licensed moral officer with Zora, and like he's just playing it extra nerdy, and I always get the sense watching that scene that's actually closer to who he really is than the act. Like the play acting is sort of like he's really more that guy than he is the tough guy. Like I think that's why like the one scene that like I would cut out of the movie is sort of the scene where him and Rachel sort of make love, because I think it has sort of a very aggressive 80s rapey vibe that I think made sense to Ridley Scott at the time. But I just think that's of the things that have put a timestamp on that movie, that scene is the one that sort of like really sort of dates it to that specific period.
Yeah, I made a note that was very sexual assaulty, and that was a little uncomfortable. And yeah, as you say, it's a negative point against the film, because that did not age well.
And I think like even like it doesn't make sense in the context of the actual movie. Like it's one of those things where I can see the argument Ridley Scott would make for it at the time, and at the time I would still go, yeah, no, you're wrong. Like it doesn't need to be like, I think it can be presented as sort of an act of love as opposed to like an act of force. And I know like they would argue that, well, she actually sort of is consents with everything afterwards, which sort of leads you to believe that she, wasn't too harmed by it. But I still think, it just, especially now, like if it's one of those things where like, you can show something new to someone, and you really love it, but it has this one sort of like thing in there that they're going to pick up on, and you just hope that they don't make it too big a deal out of it, because then you have to go, that scene is just
it's the Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Exactly, 100%.
It's a beautiful movie, but look this other way for like a minute or two here.
Yeah. Which is because otherwise, like the relationship with him and Rachel is one of my favorite things in the movie, and I think everyone does a great job in here. But I think this is I think Sean Young was someone who photographed very well, but didn't necessarily give the best performances. But I think in this case, she actually rose to the material.
Well, it's perfect for her on-screen persona.
Yeah,
I mean, limited dialogue.
Yeah,
she has to look stoic, and when she is allowed to deliver wooden lines as a necessary attribution to the character. So it's perfect for her. And there are only a handful of films I can say, Sean Young benefited the production. Otherwise, it's like Sean Young and Ace Ventura, when you're just wondering what anyone was watching when she was on screen. But yeah, I agree. The entire movie, top to bottom, the supporting cast, it all seems perfectly cast and perfectly executed in terms of achieving the vision that Ridley Scott had for this film.
We scared each other pretty good, didn't we?
We sure did.
I'm hungry, JF.
I got stuff inside.
Were there any performances that stood out to you, Mike?
I liked Leon. the
Brian James,
Leon.
yeah.
He was, he was the creepiness that he exuded, especially that scene where he's with, Batty, and they're in the lab with all the eyeballs, and he's just sitting there behind Chew, draping eyeballs on him for no apparent reason other than that it's weird and creepy. I liked that quite a bit. I thought that was a little weird and amusing. It was an interesting touch to this film.
Well, I always liked that Leon had this very childlike quality that, and it's sort of like what happens when you give something that can, like they say, can lift 400 pounds, all day for, and go to work and just be fine. But in his head, he's basically, he's 4 years old. Like he's just, he collects photographs because that's the only memories he has. And I think there's a almost like I think that's the thing about and why it's true noir is that it's a movie where you see the hero doing his job and you don't want him to succeed, because ultimately, as murderous as the replicants are, we can understand why they're doing what they're doing. And so as he's going around killing them, we're more sympathetic to them than they are to him. Especially the scene with Zora where he kills her, it's like he's just throwing his gun out in the middle of the street. Like he could have shot anybody while he was trying to get her, and so there's a carelessness to what he's doing that is kind of disturbing.
And everyone on the streets is so jaded or distracted they don't even notice until shooting actually starts.
Well, when a 6 foot tall, beautiful woman, starts running through plate glass, you tend to notice.
Yeah, that does catch the eye, I suppose.
Can we talk about the critical reception for a minute? Because I think it's one of the more interesting evolutions of a film, because it was so wildly split when it was released. And you had Sheila Benson of the LA Times calling it Blade Crawler. And that was the overarching negative criticism, was that it was just too damn slow. And what we know about the film, I think we'd look back and assume it was due to the voiceover, the ending being too pat and kind of felt glued on from the very beginning. But
I'm sorry, it doesn't strike me as slow at all in this new cut. 2 hours is breezed on by.
Well, and it's what I think is interesting, because all the cuts were roughly 117 minutes, 116, 117. So there isn't a runtime difference. It is small changes. So what we're watching here is largely, pacing-wise, identical to what was presented in theaters. But the critics were just so confused by what this movie was trying to do at the time. I mean, sure, there were a few outliers who championed it, but even Roger Ebert's a good microcosm for this, because he was not a fan of it when it was originally released, but by the time it was all said and done, he'd added the final cut to his great movies list. There's just such an interesting reaction to it, and maybe it's because of the specific time when it was released, that it was just sci-fi overload, or people weren't willing to receive it on its own terms. But I just think that its struggle at the box office to find an audience is maybe expected, especially considering the landmines that were around it in terms of its theatrical release, because E.T. was in its third week of release and it was just chewing up the box office for miles around it. And
because you had this dark. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, it was if you're looking at E.T. as this, Steven Spielberg sort of optimistic and pleasant and family-friendly movie, and then Blade Runner comes out, And is that what people were balking at, was because they came off E.T. and this was not that? Like, there's always been a disconnect between the critical mass and the way I have perceived the movie in the terms of, because I didn't watch it in 1982, obviously, but I mean, I remember seeing it when I was very young on video, and always felt the same way about it. I was mesmerized by the way it looked, and I'm watching it when I'm 7-8 years old and going, this is pretty fantastic, and I wasn't latching on to what the movie meant at all. So that the critical thing has always been sort of an unknown to me. Like, what were people looking at? What was the cause of that?
Having like watched it like at a really young age too, and having loved it from there was never a moment where it took me to learn to love this movie. I loved it from the first time I saw it. I think that it's both, there's like a dreamlike quality to it that I think a lot of people just don't like appreciate. Like I think anything that sort of has that sort of dreamy, gauzy, sort of slow quality is instantly going to alienate some people, even people who like it in other like sort of other movies. But just the fact that I think because it was a science fiction movie was a barrier for some people. Like if this was, set in, France in 1960 and like was telling the same story, a lot of those same critics would probably just love it because they would love like how it moves and how it flows together.
But is it just expectation then?
Because they were expecting like sort of like a blockbuster starring Han Solo and Indiana Jones.
Well, I do think that E.T. coming before really hurt it.
Yeah.
Because I know it was also marketed as sort of an action adventure movie.
Well, and that's a problem, is that it's not an action adventure.
It's exactly what it's not.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you look at what's around it, I mean, consider where we were in Star Wars. This is, between Empire and Return of the Jedi, E.T. just came out. Star Trek 2 is in in its 4th week release.
The Thing is about to get crushed.
The Thing came out the same week, and that was demolished. It debuted at number 8 on the list. Blade Runner it wasn't a huge failure out of the gate. It was number 2. It made $6 million its first week, and we're looking at, money clearly isn't everything here, but it's a gauge of what people wanted at that particular moment. And you look at Blade Runner and The Thing coming out and just being buried within weeks, and you have to wonder what people were thinking when 2 of the greatest science fiction movies of all time come out in the same day, and they're like,
and like you two, I first came to this movie as a really old person, so I haven't had the time to really think about it and think about, its impact on society and culture. But I feel like the film, compared to other films from '82, was more dark and introspective and ambiguous. I'm assuming, even with the narration, as opposed to the other genre releases of '82, which was a really big year for this sort of thing. But all the other movies that came out that year were all more literal. They're more straightforward and adventurous, and explaining what's going on. There's no real ambiguity to E.T. What you see is what you get. Whereas Blade Runner seems to demand a little more effort from the viewer to really comprehend what's going on. And in the case of the theatrical cut, it sounds like it requires the viewer to kind of cut through the editorial changes imposed on it to find the core of the film. And I don't know if that's what impacted reviews or impacted viewership, but it really does stand out from the rest of the crop that came out that year.
Well, and I think there's also the issue that a lot of people need to see something several times before they can decide whether or not they're into it. And Blade Runner, as sort of a vision, was so unique and unlike anything people had seen in movies that it would basically take 10 years of people ripping off Blade Runner before people look at the original and go, oh no, that's the best one. And I think that's why it ended up getting reevaluated so hard. It was because, people just weren't like, it is a movie that, like one of the reasons why I don't think it's slow at all is because there's always so much to look at on screen that even if, plot isn't necessarily happening, there is still something gorgeous to look at. But if you're not, for whatever reason, the aesthetic, you're not into it, or you're not into the world building, then yeah, it's going to seem really slow because there are going to be a lot of moments where you're just staring at stuff and you're like, why am I staring at this? I don't care.
It sort of reminds me of 2 or 3 decades back. I read the first 102 issues of Fantastic Four by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. That was sort of the Marvel comic of the period. And as I'm reading this, having read comics for a very long time, even at that point, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, or I'm seeing various story points and I'm thinking, oh, that's where that came from, or oh, that's who invented that, or that's where that story element first popped up. That's been used a million times in Marvel and DC comics in the decades since. So seeing Blade Runner now is like, oh, that's where they're getting this from, or that's where that quote is from, or that's where this aesthetic is from. I can see the origin of all this stuff watching this movie for the first time now after seeing its sons and daughters over the decades afterwards or before this.
There's only 2 of us now.
We're stupid and we'll die.
Were there any notes that you guys wanted to highlight that we hadn't gotten around to?
Why are they called Blade Runners?
That's like
William Burroughs.
Yeah, it's from Naked Lunch, but yeah, no, it just basically Hampton Fancher thought it was cool.
He got it. Yeah, he just took it from William Burroughs, who had written a treatment. He'd written a treatment of the Philip K. Dick book and had called it the Blade Runner. I'm not sure where he got it or how he dug it up or where it came from, but it's William S. Burroughs and Fancher just latched onto it.
I do have several questions. You don't mind me throwing them at you?
Yeah.
The Edward James Olmos character, is he a replicant?
There are some eye issues. But that's one where, that one's left a lot less textually obvious compared to Deckard. I think it means more if he's human. And also, spoiler, he does have a cameo in 2049, which kind of suggests that he isn't.
Oh, okay. But he is aware of the whole unicorn thing, obviously.
Yeah. That's another thing that was added to the director's cut and the final cut, that dream sequence, which is actually, that shot didn't even exist when the first Blade Runner was made, when the first version of Blade Runner came out, because he shot it when he was making Legend, which came out after Blade Runner. So it was when
I read that was a false report.
Was that a false report? Okay.
Yeah, it said there was a lot of suggestion that he shot it with Legend, but it was shot specifically for Blade Runner, but it was just a motif that he carried over.
And this, I've only just seen this film.
Yeah.
Why the unicorn? What is that representing?
I'm not sure if the unicorn itself is just a specific symbol of anything like concrete, as much as it is probably a visual symbol that Scott knew that people would instantly recognize. So like when he had like the Edward James Olmos character doing the origami, if you just did like him dreaming about a woman, like him leaving like an origami woman have the same effect. Whereas like an origami unicorn, everyone's gonna know. Like, of course, in the theatrical cut, it doesn't make any sense because you don't have the dream sequence with the unicorn, so it's just a random piece of origami. It's only in the subsequent versions that you go, oh, he was dreaming about a unicorn and he knows about a unicorn. So,
and he isn't even really dreaming. His eyes are open.
It's just like a memory.
Almost his character is named Gaff, if I got that correct. So is he aware then that that Deckard is a replicant or might be a replicant if he's...
If he is a replicant, he knows.
Okay.
Because that would make sense. Like if they were to have like an actual, if they were to make a replicant a Blade Runner, then everyone basically above him in the pecking order would probably know that he was a replicant. They just wouldn't tell him.
Okay. So then if Deckard is a replicant, he wouldn't have the 4-year limit, would he? Or does
he? Well, he can't because he's in the sequel.
Okay.
So that's why, like, especially like, even the sequel doesn't even really answer specifically whether or not he's a replicant. By basically, if you ask Ridley Scott personally, he will tell you that Deckard is a replicant.
Now, there's no possible way for them to tell a replicant is a replicant aside from the psychological tests.
Yeah, I've always wondered like why they wouldn't give like them like a little chip or something that I think that's probably just a technological thing. They hadn't think of like, oh no, you put like an RFID chip in their like neck and you can just like, but yeah, that's sort of like, that's one of the dated aspects of that. Like now we can think of a dozen ways, whereas back then in 82, they were less aware of like ways that we could have done that.
What it reminds me a little of is of the Battlestar Galactica reboot, where they were having trouble telling the human form Cylons from actual humans. Even though at one point you see, I think it's 6, the tall blonde Cylon.
Yeah.
You see her spine light up during an intimate moment, and you think there's got to be a structure in there somewhere that would stand out to make those light. You got to be able to scan for that, Yeah. So I just figured replicants would probably have some kind of power source if they can lift 400 pounds or whatever, and work as slaves all day off world. They've got to have some kind of different structure inside their body that a scanner could pick up.
I think maybe probably the one like sort of excuse that they could give is that because replicants are basically banned on Earth, is that there's so few of them that it's actually not worth the resources to come up with like replicant detectors. So that's why they have like the simpler system, just because like Leon basically just like they're like doing the tests on everyone at this business, and it just happens that Leon was one of the subjects, and he decides to end the test before it's completed.
Right.
Let me tell you about my mother.
As I said, I'm coming at this as a newbie. These may be discussions that have been done tens of thousands of times over the 40 years.
What's great about the movie is it does like force you to ask.
These are still conversations that are still being had.
There's no definitive answer even from the sequel. So
yeah,
boy.
Have you any interest in seeing the sequel after watching this?
Oh yeah, sure.
It's really good.
Sequel.
Yeah.
I might put it off for another 30 years, but I'll see it eventually.
Yeah, no, I'm a huge fan of it. Like I actually, I think it was my favorite movie of the year it came out.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it too. It was a worthy sequel too. It wasn't just a totally separate movie that also happens to be good. It's a good continuation of this particular story.
Yeah, it's what watching this movie made me want. It made me want to spend more time in this world that they built.
And that's what it is. It's really a love letter to the sort of Scott's world building, and I think that's Villeneuve's sort of like big skill. Is he actually? I haven't watched the Dune movies yet, but just his other stuff, like he's very much able to do sort of he's able to operate on the same level that Scott does.
What's on your mind, Sebastian? What are you thinking about?
Bishop to King 7. Check.
Bishop to King 7, checkmate, I think.
Got a brainstorm, huh, Sebastian?
Okay, so it looks like it's time for trivia.
Stand by, going to air.
Stand by, Phil.
5,
Stand by music.
4,
Stand by now.
3, 2, 1.
And speed up.
I kind of was tempted to do what I did with the Truck Turner episode because my friend Devin, he was also a comic book blogger. So I made all of the questions comic book related, but because this episode is coming out so recently compared to that one, I didn't feel comfortable doing that same gimmick twice. So basically, these are mostly just questions connected somehow to the movie. No worries about getting them right. It's just some fun trivia. In Blade Runner, Newhart's William Sanderson plays a 25-year-old man with a syndrome that causes him to age rapidly. What was his actual age when the movie was filmed?
He looked like he was probably about 38 or 39.
You nailed it. He was 38.
Oh. I cheated a little by giving you two options.
But no, the first one you said was the right one. While much more famous as a director, Ridley Scott has 142 producing credits on IMDb, 161 counting those currently in development. What 1994 children's film starring Thora Birch and Harvey Keitel marked the first film he produced but did not direct?
Children's film.
Children's film.
The one with the monkey?
You got half the title.
I don't.
Oh, geez.
Monkey.
Monkey
C? Not monkey business. So monkey trouble. Monkey trouble.
You got it. Monkey trouble.
That's the only other word I could put with monkey.
He also the Browning version was also released that year, but I still to me it's more fun that Monkey Trouble was the first Ridley Scott produced film that he didn't direct. I like to live in a universe where he decided to direct Monkey Trouble. Joanna Cassidy's most recent credit was a cameo in this 2024 remake of this very memorably titled 1991 teen flick that she co-starred in with Keith Coogan and David Duchovny.
That I don't have an answer for, unfortunately.
Okay, I'll give a hint that maybe James will get. If it stars a TV actress who became a movie star and is now very beloved today.
Oh, she's in Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead.
That's it. Yeah, apparently it came out and was reviewed, but I'd only seen the trailer for Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead, which it sounds like they did sort of there are different kinds of remakes, and this one is the black remake where they remade it with black actors.
I forgot that existed. I saw that.
Yeah, but I'm curious about it because I saw on Rotten Tomatoes that it's R-rated. So it's like an R-rated remake of a children's film. So I'm kind of curious about that. Although it has a pretty low rating, it didn't get a lot of good reviews. In the original script of Blade Runner, there was a fifth replicant named Mary, played by Stacey Nelkin. Scenes with her were shot, but eventually the decision was made to cut her character out completely. What once maligned but now celebrated film sequel did she co-star in the same year Blade Runner came out?
Well, that's Grease 2.
Nope.
Which is much better.
But you have brought it up in a previous episode.
She's in Halloween 3.
That's it. Season of the Witch. She plays the hot girl in Season of the Witch. Ubiquitous 80s and 90s character actor Brian James, who plays Leon in Blade Runner, appeared as Big Teddy in this 1994 comedy that shipwrecked Chris Elliott's film career.
Cabin Boy.
That's right.
A
favorite film of mine, by the way.
Let's talk about what else he was in 1982.
Oh, he was in like 60. He was in 48 Hours. He was in I looked it up because I was looking over his credits to come up with that question, and I think he was in like 8 things in 1982. He
was in an episode of Little House on the Prairie, which is that's the bookend. Little House on the Prairie, 48 Hours from Blade Runner.
Yeah, he's one of those ones because he died fairly young. He died in 1999, but because he was in so many movies, it seems like he never died because every time you turn on a movie like from that era, though, there's Brian James.
He might have been in the A-Team that same year, something around those lines. Yeah.
Dutch actor Rutger Hauer made his Hollywood debut playing a deadly terrorist in this 1981 Sylvester Stallone, Billy D. Williams cop movie.
Oh, shoot. I can see it in my head, but I can't think of the name of it.
Yeah, James? Nighthawks. We didn't talk about Rutger Hauer. Like, of course, he has his famous speech at the end. Like, did you see that coming, or was that one that sort of like
that? I knew the speech. I don't think I was aware it came from Blade Runner, which is, I know, weird, but that's it. That was one of those things that popped up, and I said, "Oh, that's where that's from."
And Hauer actually wrote that. He actually was on set and was like, "Hey, like, why don't I just do this little thing I wrote?" And Scott was like, "Okay, sure." And it's now probably one of the most memorable parts of the entire movie.
Which sort of related to that, I going back to the actual film, I did like the fact that there's apparently a lot happening off Earth that we never see. That even though there's a lot of off-world outer space stuff, we're still on Earth dealing with stuff in the the dirty streets of the city. And I appreciated that. I kind of like the idea that there's this whole other world that we hear about but don't see. And frankly, it's implied that the off-world colonies are probably terrible. But
well, it depends on who you are, because it sounds like like people are trying to get off the planet, but like a lot of like J.F. Sebastian, like because of his illness, he that's why he's still on the Earth, and like basically like you have that sort of the implication of like, why are you still here? And it's sort of like it really sucks if you're a replicant on the off-world planets, but then like if like they even like you can even see like what the replicants actually do, like the fact that Pris is a pleasure model who serves an officer, like she's like she's a sex slave, and so it is. I think that layer adds to sort of why we sympathize so much with replicants, is that not only were they created, but they are actual slaves. They aren't like that. I think that really hits hard in the movie.
The foreskin job is Pris, a basic pleasure model, a standard item for military clubs in the outer colonies.
Along with his 400 plus acting credits, James Hong has also directed 4 feature-length films. Identify the one film he did not direct in this list of 5 titles: The Vineyard, Teen Lust, L.A. Goddess, Scandalous Behavior, Hot Connections.
I sense a theme. James Hong knows what he wants. I'm going to say, what was the third one again?
L.A. Goddess.
Oh, before that one.
There was The Vineyard, Teen Lust, L.A. Goddess.
Teen Lust is the one I'm going to say.
He directed a movie called Teen Lust, but he only appeared in a movie called L.A. Goddess.
Why are we calling it The Vineyard? Isn't it Vineyard?
That's how we say it in Canada.
That's what I figured. You didn't even know what a grape is.
In 1988, Sean Young starred in The Boost, an anti-drug movie based on a book by this highly recognizable former Nixon speechwriter, character actor, outspoken creationist, and game show title star.
Ben Stein.
That's right. Daryl Hannah took on the title of second hottest cinematic cave woman when she starred in this infamous 1986 flop based on a series of popular novels.
Clan of the Cave Bear.
That's correct. I have a copy of that, but I still haven't watched it. I feel like that's one I have to get to eventually. I know what it's 86, so when we finally get to our 86 shame down, it'll have to be one of the movies I watch. Okay, here's the last one.
Okay.
Producer Bud Yorkin became the second person after Blake Edwards to direct a film about the bungling French police detective Jacques Clouseau, who played Clouseau in his film.
Was it Steve Martin?
Nope.
No?
That was Sean Levy. This was a movie made in the 60s.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Is that Arkin? Was that in the 60s?
That was Alan Arkin.
That was later, but Alan Arkin.
Oh.
It was actually only the second movie he made after his first movie, because he'd gotten an Oscar nomination for The Russians Are Coming. The Russians Are Coming, and they were having fights with like basically Blake Edwards and Peter Sellers had said, we will never ever ever work with each other again, and they wanted to make another Inspector Clouseau movie, so they made Inspector Clouseau with Alan Arkin.
It's not very good.
Yeah. Oh no, it's terrible. It feels like sort of like it's like almost like a mix. They're trying to do James Bond, but there's also elements of like Elvis Presley movies in there, and they throw like Inspector Clouseau in the mix, and it really doesn't work.
Now, did Steve Martin play him at one point?
He did in the 2000s in movies directed by Sean Levy. There were two of them.
And it's got one good scene between the two of them. When he's trying to say hamburger.
Yeah.
Dumburger. That it's enough to make you want to watch the movie again, but realize that you don't want to watch it again.
I actually have if you search Alan Mott, Inspector Clouseau, I have a whole article where I talk about specifically the Alan Arkin movie, but also just sort of there's a fascinating thing about like sort of that franchise, about how basically at a certain point Blake Edwards became obsessed with the idea of proving that he was the reason why those movies were great and that it wasn't Peter Sellers. And so that's why he made like a movie based on with nothing but outtakes. And then he made the one with Ted Wass. And then he made the one with Roberto Benigni. Like he just kept trying, like, I'm going to make a movie that proves that I was the genius behind the Pink Panther and not that asshole actor I was forced to work with.
Because there's the film that was made right after Peter Sellers died, right?
Yeah. That's the one that's all outtakes. Yeah.
That's all outtakes. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. They famously they had David Niven return to that one, but he was so ill at that point that it's actually Rich Little doing his voice. So we have now dedicated a full Cinema Shame episode to one of the greatest sci-fi movies of all time. Thanks, Mike, for giving us this chance to talk about it, and thank you for sacrificing. You said you haven't done it in a while, but it was memorable enough that I definitely remembered what a big deal it was when you said that you were willing to do it.
Well, when you first asked me, that was the movie I immediately suggested, and you said, "Oh, that was the film I was going to ask you to do." So it all worked out.
I have one final question. You know the band Arctic Monkeys?
I've heard of them.
There's a song on their excellent Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino record that the lyric is, "What exactly is it you've been drinking these days? Jukebox in the corner, long hot summer. They've got a film up on the wall and it's dark enough to dance. What do you mean you've never seen Blade Runner?"
I told a couple of people that I was doing this podcast, and the film we were doing was Blade Runner because I'd never seen it, and their reaction was invariably, "You've never seen Blade Runner?
What do you mean you've never seen Blade Runner?" It's perfect. It's a perfect lyric.
I like these people are low key, like basically saying they've never read your blog or followed your Twitter account.
That's fair enough.
Our theme song was written and recorded by Preacher Boy. Hear more from the godfather of alt blues at preacherboy.com. You can find us on Twitter at CinemaShame and on Instagram at CinemaShame Podcast. If you have a confession you'd like to make on CinemaShame, email us at cinemashame@gmail.com or send us a message on Twitter. That's all for today's episode.